All right, I think we can just go through the main agenda for today. So the main idea for this workshop is to go through some of the reports and some of the previous mistakes that people have made whilst building the reports. It's not necessarily that these mistakes are major or they're completely beta reporting experience or anything like that. The main idea about today is just to showcase some of the things you should pay a little bit more attention to when developing the reports. Things like, for example, reset button, things like data visualization in general, like what chart types to use for what scenarios and these sort of things, the data relationships and those sort of things. Just kind of going to go through them and tell you what to kind of pay more attention to. One of the things that I definitely want to say is always remember that what you hear here is basically my tips from my side and from ZoomCharts, of course, as well. But it doesn't mean that it's, written in stone and this has to be done. You can always do things a little bit differently, but it's the general idea that I'm talking about, just so you can understand and feel a little bit more into the shoes of a report user, not the report developer. I know it's usually a very hard line to distinguish because I'm on the report developer side as well, right? So when we're building reports, one of the first things we do is we think about how am I going to visualize everything. But the first thing you should do actually is talk with the end user itself. So you need to understand what charts does he want to see, what KPIs he wants to see, how he wants to interact with things, and so forth. So those are the kind of primary rules that you go through. You understand the needs of the actual user rather than just giving them something you understand, but they don't know how to use. All right, so without any further ado, let's just go through some of the reports in the previous challenges and see what could be, improved on them to get better results and kind of showcase the data a little bit more efficiently. Before we do that, of course, one thing that I forgot to tell you is don't forget to also check out the mini challenge for ZoomCharts. So for this Onyx data challenge, we have our own mini challenge. Of course, you can register for it. There are a couple additional rules, like, for example, you do need to use ZoomCharts visuals in the report and so forth. But the main idea why I wanted to showcase this is to remember that you need to register. You can get a developer's license. It means that you do not have to pay anything for the licenses itself. You can use the developer licenses and use all the visuals and all the capabilities without any additional fees. Now, another important thing I wanted to quickly showcase is under resource segment, you have this section webinars right here. And this experience is going to change a little bit in the few following days, but whilst we're here, might as well showcase the current one. And under webinars, you're going to see the full list of upcoming webinars. So in this case, you can see for Onyx data, we're actually going to have another workshop that's going to be on the 16th of November. And this is the one where we're going to talk about how to visualize the current data set that we have for the November challenge. This time, we're not going to talk about the data set itself. We're going to talk about other stuff. So in this one, we're going to focus on the YouTube data set that we have created for the November challenge. And then, of course, on the November 30th, there's going to be a little awards kind of ceremony meeting where we announce the winners, we talk with the winners a little bit more and so forth. So trying out also something new. Based on your feedback, this is what we saw that you actually guys would want to see and would want to hear. So if any of these interest you, you can always go to the webinar section and see what's happening in our agenda. As far as the recording goes, this usually is one of the questions for newer members of the audience. And yes, every single session that we do is recorded, meaning that after the session, if you have to leave sooner, that's okay. You're going to receive a recording itself. And if you know anybody else who just, wasn't able to join the session today, they are going to get an email with the recording itself so they can afterwards watch it and rewatch it if it's necessary again and again. So that's always going to be sent to you. No worries about that. All right, so let's jump into the reports. So this is one of the reports that was submitted for the Spotify challenge. And one of the things that I noticed here when I started to work with is actually this chart right here. And what I wanted to ask you is, can any one of you spot what is the mistake that has been made here, which is actually kind of critical? Any ideas, anything, just throw it right in the chat if you notice anything wrong about it. Well, not wrong, but in this case, it is wrong. Anything that stands out. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to 1 minute. Got to keep it on the clock, right? Anybody? No? No ideas? All right. What happens if you look at the legends? So what we can see, there's actually 5 different sub-properties that the lines are getting split into. But one of the lines, actually this one right here, this is the first thing that I noticed. It seems weird that one particular category doesn't have a color, right? But if you hover over any part of the categories on the timeline in this case, you can see that valence is actually in exactly the same color as the background of the chart. So what it essentially does is makes that line to be completely invisible. Because the markers are there, the line is there, it's just completely invisible because it matches the background color exactly. And you can kind of see it. So for example, if I hover over certain areas, you can kind of see right here. See, there's a little gap in the line, very small one, but there is one. If we hover here, we can see it moved up there. Now it's down here. Now it's somewhere up here. So the line is there, but because of the color, it's completely invisible. So this is one of the things you have to be cautious about. Most likely how this happened is pretty simple. The developer created a theme for the report, and what the chart does, it basically takes individual colors based on the color palette that you have provided. And that violet, well, light violet, I'm not an expert in arts, so I don't know the exact word, but this color right here, you know, the one that's missing, that color is one of the primary colors of the palette. So what happens is the chart takes it as one of the colors for the legend, right? Makes sense. So you have to always check the visual backgrounds and if all the lines are visible. This is something you have to be cautious about. If you're going to submit a report, not even to us, but for example, if you make one for the company and you have a line that matches the background completely, it's not there. You can say it's there, but from a user perspective, I don't see it. The other thing is you can see that there's actually some text right here. And what has happened in this case, the chart has been created before and the text was added afterwards. And for the text block, there's probably the boundaries somewhere around here. You can see it stops showing the tooltip around here. Let's see. No, it's actually here as well. So somewhere around here it stops. What happens in this case is you have to be careful about the order of the elements. So for example, just to give you a quick showcase of what happened there. Let's say I actually can take this chart right here. I'm just going to make a copy of it. A little bit smaller because the page size switched. So you can see these elements right here, right? And if I add a text block on top of it, I'm just going to take a white line and put it like this. You can see these items that are there are no longer visible. If I make this text box, for example, fully transparent, I can see that the items are there, but there's no way for me as an end user to get to them. So one thing you have to be cautious about is thinking about the order on how you set the elements. So for example, in this case, for the end user to actually interact with these items, I would need to switch around that the chart is on top of the text block. And now the user is able to go to these ones, open up the focus mode, open up the drill down and so forth, if it would be the native charts, but the text would still be here. So you always have to think about the visuals and everything you put on a report canvas as it has its own layers. For those of you who, for example, I remember in my days when I was in, not even high school, there was I think senior year or something like that, when we had the IT classes or the computer science classes or whatever it's called. The thing that you have to worry about is, if you remember, you had GIMP as one of the, for example, visualizations tools because it was free for schools. Now you have Photoshop, you have Figma and these sort of things, but GIMP also gave me the idea that things are always positioned in layers. So you have to think about how to place them, where to place them, what's the order of them, and so forth. So it's a small little thing, but you can see it can make a major difference in the report usage itself. Because for example, if I switch this one from our timeline visual, let's say, to just a native line chart, I have these drill down buttons, right? Where I can change the hierarchy, I can go down to next level and so forth. If I have the text box on top of it, there's no way for a user to actually interact with these. If he knows that he can do a drill down and all these through the right click, sure, it could save you, but you lose like 90% of the visible information, because knowing right click is already something you have to teach them or they have to figure out. When he sees the buttons right there, right, why not just use them? That's one of the things. Now, what else? I think in this one, everything else was fine. Let's see, one thing I'm going to quickly double check as well. So I filter something out, reset. Yeah, this one works good. All right, so this was the two things that I noticed for this report. Now, if we go to this one, these are all the challenge submissions. So it's not like we're trying to, shame somebody or something like that. No, never think about it as shaming or, showing your mistakes or anything like that. Every single one of us is going to make mistakes. When I created reports, I made hundreds of mistakes. I learned from mistakes, and that's how you get better. Change the mindset of, being worried about your mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. That's fine. You just need to learn from them. So what we have here is basically through three main views that the user can go into. So for example, if I go into highlights, ooh, that was not to pop out. Happens to everyone, right? There we go. So if I go into highlights, you can see that we have this kind of switch right here. And what it allows me to do is switch between three different views. If I look at the pages, the three views are streams, lists, and collaborations. So if I click, for example, on this one, this is now a list page. This is the collab page. You can see the pages being switched, right? So there's actually things being switched around there. Okay, cool. But the main issue with this switch is, can any one of you tell me which page or which view I am on right now without looking at the pages? Because remember, not everybody is going to know that these pages are switching. This could have been just a bookmark with different states. So whenever you are implementing items like these, like for example, to switch between different views, always make sure that a user can distinguish which ones are selected and which ones are not active at the moment. It is very important for the user to understand how to navigate the report. If you just game switches, sure, it gives him the power to switch around with different views and everything, but without knowing which is which, it's kind of hard for me to understand, okay, is this the list part, or am I in the collaboration side of things, or what's really happening there? So this is one of the things. Of course, we can see the pages here, but that's not going to save me every single time, right? The other thing, also talking about buttons, is do not forget that you have full control over what is being shown in the tooltip of a button. For example, let's see, do I have any bookmarks here? In this case, I do have. Cool. Or actually, I'm just going to make a regular button just to keep things simple. Let's go for a blank button. So when I hover over it, you can see in this case, there's nothing really happening. That's because there's no action associated with the button. Now, if I hover over the button, it's going to take, as you all know, as soon as you enable action, you need to hold down Control if you're in edit mode, right, to activate it. But you can see there's a tooltip describing this action. You can actually change this text. So for example, if you go to Actions, there's a section of tooltip. By default, there's no text, so that's the default one. But as soon as you write in here, for example, I don't know, test tooltip content, and I hover over the button, you can see that is the text that I provide. So even these small little tooltips is something that helps you to promote or to inform the user on what is he going to do by pressing this button. Again, if we go to this one, the coloring is one of the things. The other thing is, if I hover over them, the only thing it says to me is click here to follow the link. Now, as a new user, my first question would be, what link? What are you talking about? Right? I'm not crazy, right? You would have the same question. Please tell me, at least one of you, that you had the same question. So having these little tooltips, instead of just keeping as a generic text, for example, in this case, click here to follow the link, I would change it to, for example, click here to open the list view. Click here to open the I don't know what it was, the list, the stream view, and the collaboration view. So the user understands, okay, what am I doing with this interaction? If I click on it, what am I going to be seeing? That's one of the things. The other thing is, if there's just a few different visuals that you switch around, one of the things that always helps you to, let's say, again, inform the user as to what's happening, create some titles that switch with it. Like in this case, for example, okay, I see different charts switching. Okay, there's at least something different in the visual look of it. But if you switch between these two pages, let me close the page tab here. So if I switch between these two pages, the KPIs are the same. These icons kind of look the same. So at the first glance, I'm like, okay, what really changes, right? So one of the things you could do is, for example, extend the title and say, for example, highlights is the main segment that we're on, but you're looking at streams. As soon as you, for example, switch it to list, this changes also highlights list. So again, provide as much information for the user so he understands where he is, what is he looking at, and what I can do here. There's a reason why, for example, a lot of the reports that you're going to be seeing nowadays is having one of those information overlays, for example, or information buttons to provide context to the user. Yeah. So you get lost by using them. That is one of the things. The other thing is, think about the in-report navigation itself. So in this case, the way the report has been built is we have these three different main views. If I open it up, I can switch between three sub-views, and I can go back. So the navigation has been created basically through three different main pages, always going back to home page. But if you want that, that is one applicable approach, and that is completely fine. It is working just fine. It's not like it's going to break the report by default, right? Well, what you could do is actually bring those three main pages and have, for example, three separate tabs so the user again knows, okay, how many categories did I actually have here for the segments, and what am I actually on right now? It does mean, yeah, sure, you do need to pay a little bit more attention to what is visible on every single page. It does require a little bit more, playing around with the reports, with the elements, and setting them up, making sure that the right one is highlighted and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's about the usability of the report. I think I've mentioned this before, but I can repeat this hundreds of times, and it's never going to get old. At the end of the day, you are not going to be the one using the report. Always think about it like this. You're usually creating reports for somebody else to use. Just because you understand how things are being set up there, how the navigation works and everything, doesn't mean that the person on the other side sorry guys, just a little bit of a tongue twister there. So it doesn't mean that the person on the other side understands what's really happening there. That is why you always want to communicate with the end user and, for example, give them the report in segments. So for example, you talk about the navigation first. So if I do this and this and that, will you guys be okay? Give them an example so they can play around with it and they can test it if it makes sense. If it doesn't, just rework it. It's fine. Every single report is going to have multiple iterations. I've built thousands of reports, and even to this day, I haven't built a single report which just works excellently with the first try. There's always going to be some little improvements that you do. Either it's the position of the buttons or the name of the elements or something else. But since you're not the actual user, you might not notice them straight away. That is why communicating with both ends is so important. So this was for this one. Now, what else we have here? This one. On this one, the tricky part was, so everybody agree this seems like a reset button, right? Means that it should reset all the filters that I have applicable on this page. If I test it out on the slicers, so I select a year, for example, I select an artist, I'm going to choose a different one. So I have some data, there you go. I can set the timeline, I can see if there's any collaborations, I can see that there's a feature for this artist. So I go through it and I'm like, okay, I'm going to clear the slicers. Looks good, looks to be working just fine. But then you start to play around also with the visuals. So for example, I actually want to see, let's say, data for January itself. So 2023, just the January. So I'm going to go to 2023, January 1st till January 31st. Okay, you can see there's one particular year for 1 month. most artist with the highest streams is Miley Cyrus. Cool. I can see what key the songs are in. So if I choose one, okay, I can see some other artists right here. I filter it out. Then I'm like, I lost track of what I just did. I want to go back to the beginning and start all over again. So if I click reset, what do you expect to happen? You expect everything to get back to the initial view, right? Because you want to clear everything that you just did. But if I click on reset, the only thing that happened was the slicers were cleared. So in reality, this button is actually, instead of a reset button, it's clear slicers. Slicers are not associated directly with other visuals. So you would still have to click, for example, reset on the donut chart. You would still have to click reset on the combo bar chart just to get back to the initial view. And this is one of the reasons why I usually recommend you to, whenever you build a report, play around with it. Sure, it adds some extra minutes or, hour on top of it just so you can kind of play around with it. But always try different things that you have on the report page. Think about it as somebody just sent you this report. What can you do about it? See if the slicers work, see if the visualizations filter each other, see if you can clear everything. So in this case, I would just, instead of leaving this button as clear slicers, because that is a functionality that we have in Power BI, it's right here. So under insert, buttons, clear all slicers. So this is the button that was used in the report. This does not clear interactions from the report, from the visuals in the report. Exactly, Federico. Check, double check, triple check, and if you have to, go for the 10th check. Give it to your grandma, your girlfriend, your wife. Everybody needs to check your report just to make sure that, there's nothing unreasonable about it. So that is one of the other things. Now, how would you fix this, right? For example, you're new to Power BI, you saw this button right here. Okay, so we have clear slicers, but then now Aivis is telling me, hey, there's actually something else I need to do. I need to clear every single filter on the page. So how do I do that? Actually, to set it up, it's even simpler than going for the reset slicers. So the way you would do it is, for example, we have a page right here. I'm going to delete this button. I'm going to create it with you from scratch. So I'm going to close a couple of tabs right here. So this is the page I have here. And you can see I can filter things out. If I click things filter, I click on the donut chart, that filters. I click here on industry, that also filters. But now I would have to get back to the initial view. So how do you do that? First of all, you need to make sure that you don't have applied any filters on the high level. One way on how you can do that is if you hover over a visual, you can see right here, you have this like a funnel. And that icon means filters on this visual. And in this case, I can see there aren't any filters applied right now, meaning that I'm on a default view, nothing has been filtered. This is my initial view. Now, in order to save this view, I like when these tooltips suddenly appear up here. Okay, now they disappear. Happens. So I want to save this view. I go to view section and I enable bookmarks. That is going to open up this little section right here. And all you have to do is create a bookmark and name it reset page 1, for example. So I know which page it is. Then I go to the insert, buttons, and for example, blank. I want to keep it as simple as possible. I went with a blank button, and I'm going to say that this one is not going to have any visual borders or anything. So I'm disabling those. It's not going to have an icon, but it is going to have text. And the text is going to be reset filters. I'm just keeping it very simple. Of course, if you want to button to be more prominent, you can just say, for example, you can add a border around it, or you can add a fill color to it. So for example, let's say we're on the grayscale of a little bit of a blue, so something like that. Just to, not too intrusive, but kind of goes with the theme itself. So if I click on it right now, nothing happens. That is because I need to associate this button with the action. So we enable actions, it changed the bookmarks, and reset page 1. And now let's try it if it works. So again, I choose, for example, 2019. You can see data gets filtered. I choose a particular investor, data gets filtered. I choose a particular industry, data gets filtered. At one point, I'm like, I'm really lost here. I don't know what I did. I just want to go back to the initial view. I click on reset filters, and that takes me to the very beginning of where I was. Simple, yet very efficient. You cannot imagine how much you're actually, losing from your report if you don't add a reset button. It might seem not that necessary at first, but trust me, the more you start to work with reports, you start to understand why it is so important. Because you as a developer know what's happening there. A new user doesn't know what's happening there. He's just clicking on charts and things get filtered, right? He wants everything to be as simple as possible. All right. So reset button, or reset bookmark in this case, is one of the things I would recommend to have in every single report. It doesn't matter where you place it, how you, showcase it or whatever, but there needs to be a way for the user to get back to the initial view. You can, of course, create smaller bookmarks, for example, just to clear one or the other visual or certain parts of the visual, or, have one to call it, for example. Let's say somebody would want to go for an approach like this. Instead of reset filters, I would call it reset view. And if I would have slicers, I can, of course, also add a button which would say clear all slicers, but I would rename it clear all filters. The reason for that, I think you can agree with me that the first time you heard this word slicer, it didn't click in your mind that that's a filter. But it is a filter. So you want to also be careful with the word choices you add to the canvas and the elements and everything. So always think about it. All right, what else? This report. So one of the first things that I noticed here is be consistent with your icons and your elements that you position on the report page. For example, in this case, you can see that every single icon right here on the default view, they look good because they're from the same kind of family, right? They all have a blue background and some transparent elements. But if I change between these views, so for example, right now, this one's active. And the active is brought a little bit outwards with the shadow effect. Cool. I can also see that the icon is going to change. No issue whatsoever there. But what I have issue with is this one is a house in a more cartoonish way. If I click on the keynote, you can see this suddenly turns basically in a different color scale for a very similar button. Okay, seems a bit weird, but I'll go with it. I checked the microphone, and the microphone is again a completely different design. I went with the light bulb, and the light bulb is again completely different design. So just to keep it simple for the user, try to keep the style of the icons in the same approach. So for example, one of them is in black and white, let's say, or monochrome, and the other one is colorful. Do not jump around with completely different styles of icons. It's just one of those elements that, users pay attention to, but it's not that important. But from a visual perspective, it's a bit of an annoyance when things just jump around in different views, different styles and everything. What else here? Yeah, so for example, these icons are for the navigation. Here's the reset again. This one at least says reset all slicers. So I can't really, say it's bad because it clearly states reset slicers. It is what it is. But the other thing that I noticed here is, can anyone of you, for those of you who have actually played around with slicers a bit more, why do you think these ones are two separate things? So we have two slicers. One of them has, you can see, a drop-down list with all the values. And then you have search track, which basically does the same thing. Because, for example, if I type in, let's say, 295, just for the simplicity, filter it out here, and you can see that is exactly the same song. So it's exactly the same result. The only difference is one of them is a search, the other one is a drop-down, right? if you want to have search in your slicer, that is possible with the native slicer as well. It is a little bit hidden, and trust me, all of us who have built reports before, this is always a little bit annoying, but we've gotten used to it. Let's say it like that. So in order to have a slicer and a list with a search, you of course need to add a slicer to the report page. So let's go right here and say, for example, I want to see the investor names. I'm going to style it to be a dropdown. Sorry, not child, but dropdown. So right now, we're the same as this one now, right? Well, the font family changes and these sort of things, but that's not important. So I have a list, but I can't really find a particular name. So the way you enable search for a slicer is by clicking on the ellipsis on the top right of the visual and clicking on the search. It is very well hidden. Trust me, every single person who has built reports previously and worked with the slicer knows this. It's also annoying a little bit, but it is possible to enable a search function in the list of values. Things do get changed in Power BI as well. They're going in a better direction. So for example, you can see also here, we used to have formatting options under this little arrow right here, but you can see now they've moved all of this into the formatting options, which is a lot more convenient. But for those of us who, for example, were used to the previous approach, it took us a bit of time to get used to the new setting, like a positioning, grouping, and everything, because it was a little bit different before. So things do change from time to time. And I really hope that they add the search as a formatting option that you can just enable. Because if you look here, nothing indicates that there is a search available. Yeah, Sabina also just mentioned in the chat, are you enjoying the workshop? So please leave your feedback. You can do it now or you can do it a little bit later. That's completely fine. The main reason we want to get the feedback is so we can understand if these sessions are needed or if it's a complete waste of time and you think they're boring. If there's anything else missing from them, just let us know what else you are looking for. And from my side, just a quick question in between is, if everybody who wants to, of course, you could just type in the chat with a plus or a minus. Have you learned something new so far and useful? Keyword being useful. You can learn something new very quickly. I could say things like, for example, I don't know, my height is 125 centimeters. Did you learn something new? Probably. Was it useful? Probably not. So just with a plus or a minus if you were able to learn something new and useful. I'll check it afterwards so that I can understand if what I'm talking about is actually needed. All right, what else? This report. So what happened on this report is two things. This was actually the winter report. And the two things that were happening here, which I would improve from my side. If I choose one of the years on a timeline, you can see a drill down, right? But the other one is now showing me one particular column. Okay, I go back and I try a different approach. What happens if I select a few years? You can basically see what happens between the charts is you create a selection on one of them and the other one only reflects the available data. And that is because our timeline actually has two different modes on how the x-axis can actually aggregate. So for example, if I create a regular timeline and I say that, so I think we had a date. Yeah, we can go for original air date. Doesn't matter what we're doing here. So we're under seasons, okay? And I'm gonna add something like a season index in one of the counts, which is gonna be count. There we go. I just want to plot a visual, right? It's not that important. So, and I'm gonna make an exact copy of it. The two visuals are exactly the same. If you go under formatting options and under x-axis, there's actually a setting called dynamic alt data. If this has been disabled, what it means that if you create a selection, you only showcase on the other side the cutoff version of the data. Now, this is very important for some cases where you want to understand how much is left of the original time span. But if you want the other chart to actually adapt to those changes, so for example, these 4 columns are now becoming the only 4 columns and I don't have any white space, you need to enable dynamic all data. So for example, if I click on this chart and enable dynamic all data, I reload the page just to make sure I'm back on the initial view. I select, for example, 4 years, and you can see the difference. So instead of cutting off from the original time span, I only showcase something that is relevant right now. So if I zoom into one particular year, in this case, you can see I still have this year on a high level. That is because the chart is very flexible. And one of the things you can do is define what is the maximum unit width you allow it to have. So for example, if I say that this is going to be something like, I don't know, 50, for example. Again, reload the page just to make sure that everything's on a decent view. You can see that 50 might be a little bit too small because now I have these extra years, because 50 is the width of this bar. But if I drill down into one particular year, that is going to also allow me to have a more narrow view of the same data. So always think about how you interact between the charts. If you don't know if it's possible to do that or not, never be afraid to reach out to us. That is the reason why we offer the individual consultations. If you have something that you think could be improved about the charts, where you cannot just figure out, for the love of God, right, how to do this, just reach out to us. You also have an email, webinars, at ZoomCharts.com, where you can send in your questions and we'll get back with a reply to you. So use all the available resources for you to make sure that you can build the best report possible. That was one of the things. The other thing that I noticed here, which is one of the things that I always say be very careful with, and that is the cross-chart interactions. Now, for those of you who have been using Power BI a little bit longer, you do know that Power BI basically has 3 ways on how charts can interact between each other. They can filter, they can highlight, and they can do nothing. So those are 3 different types of things that the charts can do. And one of the golden rules of a report is do not mix and match these interactions in a single page. If you try to go with one approach, it's always going to result in a better view for the end user. Now, the reason for that is because in this case, for example, if I filter out a larger time span, so you can see this physically filters out the data, right? I can adjust the viewport and everything, of course, but that made a filter. Now, if I click on one particular major or minor role, you can see this actually uses highlight, right? And if I choose specific, I want to see what happens in a very, very extreme case, for example. And I say, okay, I can see that Taylor Swift has 25 songs, I think. Yeah, 25 songs in this particular layout. Or this, let's say, The Weeknd has actually 9 songs. I'm getting blind. Yeah, but that's fine. But if I cross filter now, so if I hold down Control and I select this one, you can see only this part is relevant now. And they're like, okay, but I can still notice it. That is true. But if I then select a smaller key, you can see that half of this chart is completely obsolete because I'm not using any of the keys. And here, for example, these columns have no value whatsoever on top of them. So that again becomes obsolete. So be very careful when you mix filters with highlights and with visuals that do no interaction whatsoever. Like I said, and what Federico also mentioned in the chat, play around with it, check your report, see the filters, interact with the visuals, see what happens with your report. If you can break it, trust me, the end user is going to break it 50 times faster. It's very simple to break a report if you don't know what you're doing. And if it's your first time using a report, you're just going to be clicking around and things are going to break. That's inevitable. So the way you define the interactions is, so for example, for our pro visuals, we always go with filtering as the main interaction itself. But if you use, for example, in a report, the native visuals, So for example, let's go for something like this. Okay, we have a little bit too many names. Let's go with core. This one's going to have fewer names. Yeah, this one's fine. Well, the labels are all over the place and the data format, but we can, of course, adjust that. But it's not crazy, right? But the numbers are not that important. What's important now is if I also add, for example, a column chart, which is going to have, I don't know, the month and the viewership, for example. So by default, you're always going to have cross highlight. See, as soon as I choose a particular area, that highlights data on the other. If I choose something here, that highlights the proportion from the original data set. Sorry. So by default, it's cross highlighting. Now, if you click on one of the visuals, you can see that a new tab appears here at the top called Format. And that is only visible when you have a visual active. What I mean by active is you have it selected. You open it up and you can see here Edit Interactions. And you can see right here, these three new icons appear. So for example, if I have selected this visual, I can define how this visual is going to interact with this visual. And I can set it, for example, to highlight, filter, or nothing. For the sake of the demo, I'm going to create 2 copies. I mean, there are 3 interactions, but I think we can all understand what nothing does, right? Well, it does nothing. So one of them is going to filter, the other one's going to highlight. Like that. So if I click on a column, you can see the difference in results. For the highlighted version, this is one of the pitfalls. You can easily highlight a proportion for the data that is so relevantly small that it's pretty much invisible. If you use filter, you're always going to relatively scale the available data. So whatever the choice is, how many of your columns you have filtered out, there is going to be a relative scale for them. Whereas for the highlight, you can always end up with a situation like this where, there is, you can see 0.45 is the highlighted portion of the whole slice. So be careful with mixing these interactions, because at the end of the day, it's not that you're confusing just yourself, but for the end user, you also make him feel like that something is broken, right? Think about it if this is your first report, right? So if I click on it, this filters, this highlights. Okay, these are 2 different views for the same information. But what happens if I start to play around with different interactions between the same visuals? So for example, this one is going to filter out the column chart below. This one is going to highlight it. So I'm going to say, okay, if I choose this one, I can see the data filters out. Okay, that's the approach. Cool. Now, if I choose something here, suddenly it highlights. And the first question that I typically get is, so which one is it? Is one of them not working correctly? Are they doing 2 different things? Why are they doing 2 different things? Why is it not doing the same thing? Like I said, think about you're using the report as an end user. You as a report developer might have an answer to it. If it has a particular scenario why this is happening and you need to implement it, of course do it. But please provide some information for the end user. Add an information button, for example, with a little tool to describing that this visual is going to highlight the data for the rest of the report page. This visual is going to filter the data for the rest of the report page. Give him some information to work with. Right, that goes for that. This one. And this one's going to be the last thing we're going to cover today because we're starting to run out of time and I want to go through the Q&A section as well. But one of the most important things that I can always recommend you, like I already did it hundreds of times before, always play around with your data. You might ask me why? Well, because of cases like this, for example. If I filter out something here, you can see the data got filtered, right? The KPI is adjusted and everything changed. Now this is a visual, right? Of course I want to work with it. So if I click on it, what I would expect is that at least something happens with the report page, right? But suddenly nothing happens. And there might be situations where this has been done intentionally. Like I said, if it is, please provide me with some additional context. In this case, there's nothing, this information is just for the visual itself. There's nothing that tells me that this is not supposed to happen. Also, these icons are getting in front of my chart, so try to position them where they don't overlap. And if I click on it, you can see because of the element, it kind of goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, because two different things are going in front of each other. Now, the reason why also this might be happening is the data relationship itself. So for example, what could have been done, I'm not entirely sure what happened in that particular scenario, but I'm just thinking about what I've seen so far with other reports as well. And what I've seen so far is, for example, instances where users try to, for example, see the data set itself. They look at the data model and they're like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to calculate something particular, but I do know that I can create a summarized table. So what they do is, for example, they create a new table and they write a relatively simple DAX. This is going to be just a table, right? I'm going to say summarize. Table is going to be investors. I'm going to group it. Few extra characters unnecessary. I'm going to group it by investor name. All. I'm going to give it name total investments. And the expression I'm going to use is going to be sum of invested amount. This can also be done with other approaches with relationships and everything, but this is what I've seen also in other reports. So people do something like this. They create a summarized table. Cool. They create a visual. Very good, right? We're on the right track. So where is it? Temp calculations. There we go. That's a donut chart. Okay, thank you. Can you move? Thank you. You know how it is like a live session, right? And you're trying to do something and then everything goes the other way. So we have a donut chart right here. We could, of course, play around with it and say, okay, I only want to see top 5 investors and so forth. Okay, but I have the investor view. And then I go for something completely different. And I say, okay, I actually want to see some information regarding the seasons. So I'm going to go and say, I want to create a combo chart. Or actually, we could go for a combo bar. Yeah, because of the space, because of the data type as well. So I find seasons. I say, I want to see the season number on the category. And as far as the series go, I just want to count how many times does this appear. So that gives me an identification of how many investments have been happening or how many episodes are happening there. So I have the data. It's all in Power BI. And if I click on this one, nothing happens. Why is that? That is because by default, when you create a summarized table, it is not associated with anything else. It is a separate table that lives in a model that's right here. You can see. I can close this one. Thank you. Temp calculations for investors. Now, if I want to make sure that this is still becoming an interactive report, I would do, this is not the greatest approach of what I'm showing in sense of what I'm summarizing, because that could be all done from a single table, but it's the idea. So I connect these two tables now so that the relationship goes throughout the whole data set. I go back to the report view, I click on the investor, and you can see the data is getting filtered out. There's not a lot of changes because a lot of the investors are in the same season, but if I go for example, guest investors, you can see there's quite a bit of a difference there in the data set. So you can see, okay, things get filtered here. Now, if I click on seasons, the investors don't get filtered. Don't forget, the relationship can have cardinality. So in this case, I would say I actually want this one to work on both ways. So now I can play around with the data set and say, for example, okay, I actually want to see what in seasons was Laurie in. Okay, cool. What else happened in season 2? I click on season 2. That showed me how the donut also switched around a little bit based on the investors that were there. So all of that is very dependent on what you're showing and these sort of things, but don't forget to connect your data so that the user can actually interact with all elements of the chart and don't have an experience where something filters, something doesn't. Again, users are going to think something's broken. All right, time for some questions. Let's see. So, first one. Federico, when exporting a report as a PDF, we have encountered some issues. Any known problems? Depends on where you are exporting from. So, for example, if you export from a desktop, one of the things that I know that some cases have is that it exports actually not the full view of the report page. So in some cases, it actually cuts off like half of the page. That is a known issue that happens with everybody who's using Power BI. I think with the latest changes, they actually adjusted it. We can see it. Yeah, it seems like it's adjusted. Because previously it was cutting off. Essentially what was happening is even though you had the page at a different resolution scale, so for example, you had 1080 times 1920, but then it exported to 720 times 1080. So completely different resolution was exported. The other thing that might happen with custom visuals, especially when you are exporting them, is only certified visuals can be exported. And that is a prerequisite from Microsoft's side. So if you are using, for example, a development version of the visual, if you're using an organizational visual that is not the one that's coming from the app source, so as soon as it's not coming live from the app source and it's not certified, exporting is not allowed for that visual. Those are some of the things that I have come across. If it's anything else, Federico, just let me know and I'll take a closer look at it and see what we can do about it. So Enza, yes, sometimes I face this issue. It doesn't show as we have in our dashboard. I'm guessing that's related to the exporting as PDF, or what did you mean by that, Enza? Just to clarify. Okay, next one. Federico also asked, do you keep up highlight or disable it in options? In my reports, I disable by default. Well, it's a bit of a different story probably for me specifically, because most of the reports that I build are always built with, you can guess it probably, they're built with ZoomCharts visuals. And ZoomCharts visuals default interaction option is filtering. That is the main capability that our visuals, the pro version of the visuals, are using. So I very rarely even use highlighting as an option. I see that filtering is far more superior than highlighting. Sure, highlighting has its own use cases, but if you have to put it in, a scale, filtering is going to undoubtedly win that case. The one tricky part that you have to pay attention to, and this is, for example, when you're building reports also with our visuals. So when we started off, we only launched the pro version of the visual. And for custom visuals, we have to determine in the code what approach we're taking with the data. And in order to keep things simple, we went with the filtering capability with the pro visuals. But there are certain things that only highlighting visuals can do. So if you want to have highlighting with ZoomCharts visuals, you need to have a pin version of the visual, not the pro version. And you can see these two are the same donuts. I'm actually just going to copy paste it. Let's say if I copy paste them, convert one of them to be a pin visual, the other one's a pro visual, and I'm going to convert this one to a native combo bar chart. So what's going to happen? This one filters out the data. You can see it. On the other hand, if I select it here, that is going to highlight it. The one thing you're going to notice, though, is that our charts do not highlight each other out. They only filter each other out. The main reason why we're doing this is because we want it to be as simple as possible for the user to interact with them. And with the native visuals, you all have probably noticed this, that if you want to create multiple selections, you actually need to hold down Control. So that passes out a combinational filter. What we did with our visuals is, and that's the reason why we went with the filtering, if you have two visuals and you just want to combine the filter, you don't have to hold any control buttons or anything. This is creating a combinational filter straight away. So there are certain reasons why we do things a little bit differently. But yeah, to answer your question, Federico, since I use mostly ZoomCharts visuals, I very rarely even use highlighting as an option. I just don't see the high value benefit of it. Okay, Enzo, happy to hear that. All right, so going through the chat about one of my previous questions. So were you able to learn something new and interesting? Federico, thank God I managed to do that. I managed to give Federico some more insights and learn something new. So that's that. Mohab, very happy that I could give you some new information. Enabling Sergeant Slicer, one of the new things. That's actually a very hidden feature, right? The slicer and the search. I remember, honestly, you want to know how I found about it? I usually say a lot of things I find through the community, right? But this one I found completely by accident. I was just playing around with the slicer, and I think I even accidentally, instead of clicking the arrow downwards, because I think it's like maybe a year ago when we still had the formatting options for the slicer under this little arrow, and I accidentally misclicked it and clicked on the ellipsis, and I saw search, and I was like, huh, you know, I'm going to try what it does. So I enabled it, and I saw that the search appears. Once you click on it again, it disappears. I was like, well, that's a very well hidden feature. Pedro, very happy that I could give you some more insights and, you know, teach you something new about Power BI and the visuals. All right. I think, what do you guys think? I think the session was not too long. It was informative. We managed to learn something new. I think we talked about the most important stuff, like the key things you want to take out of this. One thing I can always recommend at the very end is, I forgot to showcase this a little bit sooner, is, I'm going to post it in the chat, don't worry, is going to be the chart guide. Do not forget, every single chart has its own purpose and reason why you should use it. Do not use a chart just because it looks good. There's usually a type of data that you want to showcase it and that you do not want to showcase it. One example of what you should not do based on the way that the visual is built is, for example, let's say I'm going to have investment, amount invested. Perfect. So I'm going to create a waterfall chart. So waterfall chart usually is a chart that allows you to understand changes in different categories or in time and sum it up at the end. That's the default view for all of this. So if I go for something like amount of investment invested based on, let's say, guest name. Oh, sorry. Went completely their way around. We do have a lot of guests. That's not ideal. Let's go with the core maybe. Perfect. Just want to have something that you can guys see and actually read, right? Instead of going all around the place. So this visual in this case, I think you guys can agree with me. It's okay, right? It makes sense. I have different values of how different investors have invested, and this is the total amount that they have invested. Now, on the other hand, if you go for something like, let's say, the average investment amount, that is not something you want to sum up. Because if you think about it, right, every single investor has their average investment amount. We could calculate the average investment for all the investors. What's the aggregated average investment? But summing them up, giving us 2 million, it tells us nothing. It's a sum of averages. There's really nothing where you can go for this sort of an example and say, yeah, this makes absolute sense. Like, think about it. If you, for example, have delivery days in between a shipment of the product and receivage of the product, right? If it usually takes roughly around, let's say, 3 days for me or, I don't know, 2 other people to receive the package, it doesn't mean that on average it takes 9 days. No, it means that on average it takes still 3 days, right? So always be careful about what the charts show, what the chart is used for, and why is the reason why you even use it here. Think about the meaning behind the charts. All right, enough about all of this. One of the last things that I just want you guys to remember, if you do have the time, I would highly appreciate if you could leave the feedback about the session. If Sabina, maybe you could paste in the feedback form link again. In the chat's going to be in a second. So if you could leave us the feedback and tell us about the session, if it was interesting, if it was, okay, if it was bad. If it was bad, let me know about it. I want to understand from your side as well what is good, what is bad, what you're missing, what else you want to see from these sort of sessions. Because at the end of the day, our goal is to create an experience that allows you to learn from all of this. Sure, some of the information may be repetitive, but don't forget that not everybody joining these challenges is a veteran challenge, right? For some of the attendees, this is the first challenge ever. So they haven't heard things that I've said before. So don't worry about, in some cases, that there is going to be some repetitiveness, but if there are additional topics that you want us to cover, that you want us to talk about, even if it's something non-related to what we have already talked about, just let us know about it, because then we can think about it and come up with a solution for that. Because the format for this session was actually also a suggestion from you guys. You told us that you want to hear about, okay, so what was good, what was bad about, the other challenges, about the other reports, what should we pay more attention to, and these sort of things. So please give us your feedback just so we can understand if we're doing the right thing and if anything else needs to be added on top of it. If everything's great, just tell us that. I'm always happy to hear what's good, right? If it's something bad, I also want to hear what's bad because I want to improve on my side as well. Other than that, I am very thankful for everyone who joined. I appreciate you spending the time here and listening to what I had to say and present. I hope it was informative and insightful. Other than that, I wish everyone the best of the day, and I'll see you on the next event, which is going to be on the 16th of November. So don't forget to sign up for that as well if you haven't already done that. Other than that, like I said, have an amazing day, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.